so we are doing something that's slightly different than what we're normally doing on these gatherings, because normally we're just kind of going through the Bible, right? I know this is our discipleship group, and so discipleship doesn't have to simply be limited to Bible study, but since we live in a culture that is fairly biblically illiterate, despite the fact that the Bible is more easily accessible than ever before, typically we do focus on Bible study just because it's very necessary. But we are doing something a little bit different, and we are currently examining the evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Not just the biblical evidence, but just the evidence in general, the historical evidence for it. And if you weren't here last week, or if you haven't seen last week's video, I would highly encourage you to go revisit that, either after this one, or if you're watching online, pause this and go watch the other one first, because that one really is kind of like the foundational stuff for what we're going into. But I can summarize it fairly quickly, right? Because we typically meet for 2 hours each time. And last week, basically the first hour we were gathering, the first thing we talked about was the centrality of the resurrection when it comes to our faith, right? We talked about how whenever you actually examine the scriptures assert that the resurrection is the make or break moment of Christianity, right? Whenever Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 15, he says that if Christ died and stayed dead, we are of all people most to be pitied, and our faith is in vain, right? Because, I mean, if Jesus died and he stayed dead, that means that he was not the Messiah. He was not who he claimed to be. He was just another false Messiah, and best comes to best, we followed after the wrong God. Worst comes to worst, there is no God altogether, right? And so, if Jesus died and stayed dead, we have followed the false Messiah, we have blasphemed the name of God, and we should probably close down our churches and stop gathering together as Christians. Right? That's what Paul himself says. Right? And that's why that's why he says of all people we're most to be pitied. Because, I mean, think about the cost of discipleship, right? We're supposed to deny ourselves daily. We're supposed to live for a kingdom that we cannot see. And if we deny ourselves daily and live for a kingdom we cannot see, all for something that's just a pipe dream, well, that's kind of pitiful, because we're going to die and we're not going to, dwell with God forever like we thought. We might as well have just spent this life enjoying our sin, because that was basically the best there was. Or we should have spent our life pursuing another religion in the hopes that that was the correct one, right? And Jesus himself in Scripture also affirms this to be true, right? Consistently, every time somebody comes to him throughout the Gospels and says, "What is the sign you will give us that you are who you claim to be?" He basically says, "Kill me and wait 3 days." Right? One time he says, "Destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll build it back up." And another time he says, "I'll give you the sign of the prophet Jonah. Just as Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the fish, so too the Son of Man will be 3 days in the heart of the earth." Right? So both the Apostle Paul and Jesus, the two most influential figures of the Christian faith, they both agree that the resurrection is the make or break moment. Right? And then you can add to that the fact that Jesus several times prior to his death prophesied that he would resurrect. Right? And so, at the very least, his resurrection proves that he is a prophet. And if he's a prophet, that kind of says that everything else that he claimed was true as well. Right? And so there's all these things that basically point towards the resurrection being the make or break moment of Christianity. And that's why we care so much about it. The second hour of last week, we basically just talked about historical method. And we basically just broke down the, frankly, more boring aspect of what we're doing here. And we just talked about what it means to be a historian and how you can actually try to look at things objectively, right? We talked about how every single one of us is blinded by our own biases and stuff like that, and how that oftentimes shapes the discussion that people have in regards to miraculous events. For instance, since I am a Christian, it only follows that I am naturally disposed or predisposed to wanting to believe that the resurrection is true, because I have a bias there, right? I want Jesus to have resurrected because I've placed my faith in it. By contrast, an atheist or somebody of just literally any other religion, they have a natural predisposition to hoping that Jesus did not resurrect, because if he did resurrect, that gives them a lot that they have to wrestle through, right? And so everybody is approaching this conversation from a perspective of bias, right? It's literally impossible to be unbiased in regards to this situation because we have all these different factors that are coming at us, right? And so our job as historians is to try to check those biases as much as possible. First off, we have to recognize what they are. We have to kind of publicly identify them so that, if we're talking about it and somebody sees that bias creeping in, they can call us out on it. And then we need to also be willing to examine arguments to the contrary, right? And we should be willing to examine the best arguments to the contrary so that we can see what the best skeptics have to offer in opposition to our argument, right? Because if we're only looking at what the people who agree with us say, then we're just basically in an echo chamber where we're just hearing the things that we like to hear. And we don't want to do that either. And so really the last hour last week was us just trying to figure out, how do historians generally do this, right? Because obviously the resurrection of Jesus is not the only historical event that has ever taken place, right? No. I mean, our history books are lined with different historical events that historians agree happened, right? And they have to go about certain procedures to determine whether those events happened. And we talked about how we really don't teach those procedures to people nowadays in school, because in our schools, we're more focused on teaching people the scientific method, right, than the historical method. The issue is, you can't treat history the same way as science, because science is something that you can test and repeat, and you can experiment with again and again and again. History, by definition, is something that happened at one point, and it's not something that you can just repeat, right? And so you have to approach history different than science, and that's where you'll see a lot of disagreement coming up when it comes to miracles. People will say, well, we know miracles don't happen because I've never seen one. Well, that's an issue, because obviously they're viewing this from a scientific perspective. They're saying because they have not seen it themselves, they cannot attest to its truth. The issue is that miracles, by definition, are miraculous. They're exceptional, right? They're not the typical way of things. They are an exception to the rule. And so whenever we're looking at this, we have to approach it from a historical perspective. And we have to figure out, how does the historical evidence weigh in favor of the resurrection of Jesus or not? And we did talk about how some people are very biased in both directions. We talked about Bart Ehrman, right, our favorite internet atheist. I say internet atheist. He's not just on the internet. He's actually a really well-renowned scholar. And he's actually got some really good stuff. But whenever it comes to his analysis of the Christian faith, I would say that he's blinded by his biases more than he realizes, right? And this is one place where it's most evident in terms of the resurrection of Jesus, because Bart Ehrman, he claims to be an agnostic, right? But he firmly believes that supernatural events do not happen. And so whenever you actually look at Bart Ehrman's argument for the resurrection, he agrees that assuming that supernatural events could occur, the resurrection of Jesus is the best hypothesis that best explains the historical data we have. However, since he does not believe that supernatural events can occur, he argues, you know what? Even if the resurrection is the most likely explanation, literally any other natural explanation must come above that, right? And so his preconceived viewpoint of the world is shaping his conclusions before the evidence itself is. Does that make sense? We don't want to do that, right? If we're going to talk about something miraculous possibly happening, we have to at least allow for a worldview where the miraculous can occur, right? Because if you're saying miracles can never happen, you're deciding your conclusion ahead of time, right? And we don't want to do that. The cool thing is that as Christians, we already believe in a worldview where miracles can occur, right? And so for us, that's a little bit easier. But we do still want to examine the evidence as it is, and we don't want to be blinded by that stuff. Make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. And so the way that I ended last week is I told you that we are going to be looking at 5 historical bedrock facts that practically every historian agrees about in regards to Jesus. Right? So everything we're going to be talking about over the course of the next few weeks is basically stuff that everyone agrees about. Right? It's not a matter of debate. The only thing that's going to be a matter of debate is what you do with this information. Right? Whether you are an atheist, a Christian, an agnostic, a Buddhist, a Jew, a Hindu, anything, right? Practically every historian who has genuinely studied this stuff agrees on these 5 facts. We are simply going to say what hypothesis best explains those 5 facts happening, right? And the one we're going to be looking at today is a death by crucifixion, right? That is the first thing. Today we are not talking anything about Jesus' resurrection. We are simply talking about the fact that he did die, which is important because without him actually dying, he could not have resurrected, right? And the reason we have to address this is because there are theories that people have put out there, such as the swoon theory, right? I think we were talking about this at church earlier today. There are some people who will say, oh, Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He simply passed out. Well, after our discussion today, you will see how unlikely that is. And why, after seeing the evidence that we're going to talk about today, you're going to see why practically no genuine historian takes that as a credible theory, right? The only people who are going to say that are people who are grasping at straws, trying to find an argument against the resurrection. And so, having talked about this fact, I just want to be clear, at the end of today, you are not going to know for certain that Jesus resurrected. but you are going to know for certain that he did die, which is necessary for us to talk about the stuff in the coming weeks. Make sense?
Yes.
All right, cool. So, Jesus' death by crucifixion. When it comes to examining this, there are 4 primary reasons that we can believe that Jesus was in fact crucified and that he died by that crucifixion. And the 4 facts are this, right? Evidence number 1 is multiple attestation. Evidence number 2 is early attestation. Evidence number 3 is credible attestation. And evidence number 4 is the probability of surviving crucifixion. Right? So these are the 4 things we're going to be looking at today, and this is literally going to take us through the whole day. Right? So let's just start by, let me just turn it to y'all real quick because I'm going to be talking a lot today. What do you think it means whenever it says multiple attestation?
Multiple different historical sources claiming the same thing happened.
Exactly, yeah. So there are a lot of historical sources that attest to the fact that Jesus died a death by crucifixion, right? So multiple sources, right? So there's a large quantity of them. All right, what does early attestation mean?
It means early on, more likely to be either primary or secondary sources.
Yeah, so a lot of those sources came very early on after the events themselves, right? It's one thing if I told you that Jesus died a death by crucifixion, but I'm a person who is 2,000 years removed from the event, right? It is less likely for me to know what happened 2,000 years ago versus a person who was living in Israel around the time of Christ, right? And so early attestation is important as well. So multiple attestation is the quantity of reports, and early attestation has to deal with the quality of reports. And then we also have credible attestation. What does that mean?
Believable?
Kind of.
Believable, like
I
yes.
think it's more so pointing to historical scholars look to certain sources like these for other historical events that have occurred.
Yeah. Well, ultimately what it's getting at is that we have good reason to believe that the reports we're looking at are accurately telling the truth, right? There are certain people, for instance, like whenever you talk to them, you very quickly learn whether or not they are more inclined to tell the truth or more inclined to tell a lie, right? Obviously, when it comes to historical accounts, that's a little bit harder to perceive because you don't always know the character of the person who's writing these things. But from the evidence that we do have, we have good reason to believe that these are credible accounts just from looking at the accounts themselves, right? And the different things for that. And you'll figure out why that is when we get there. And then fourthly, the probability of surviving crucifixion. The main reason why this is evidence for Jesus dying a death by crucifixion is because the probability of surviving crucifixion is very, very low. Basically non-existent. As we will see later, there is literally only one single report in all history of a person surviving crucifixion, and it was a difficult process to get them to survive, and we'll talk about that. Right? And so when you take all 4 of these, you're ultimately going to be led to the conclusion that Jesus did die a death by crucifixion. And I could just tell you this and you could take it at face value, but I don't think that is as fun, right? And then you would basically just have to be trusting me that I'm telling the truth, whereas what I'm trying to do with y'all is I want to give y'all the primary sources, right? So that whenever you share it with somebody else, you'll be better equipped to actually talk about it, right? And so we're going to go through each of these 4, right? So first and foremost, we do have multiple attestation. And basically with each of these, I'm drawing from Mike Lycona's book, The Resurrection of Jesus. Basically, just really fantastic book. I recommended it last week. It's like hundreds of pages long. Just like this giant tome where he just addresses it in a very just clear, concise way. He goes a lot more in depth than we're going to go, obviously, because he's covering hundreds and hundreds of pages, and we're just meeting over the course of a few weeks. But I'm mainly drawing from this and just condensing it down, right? And so he says that the first evidence is that Jesus' death by crucifixion is multiply attested by a fair number of ancient sources, Christian and non-Christian alike. So what's really cool there is that we don't only have Christian sources that attest to Jesus' death by crucifixion. Why is that important?
Because
Yeah, it's not biased, right? Now, let's say hypothetically that only Christian sources told us about his death by crucifixion. Does that mean that it's inherently false? No, right? It could be that only Christian sources told us about those events, and it could still be true, but you could argue that they have a bias, right? And so you would have to examine the stuff with a little more scrutiny, right? Kind of like me saying that I believe Jesus resurrected. I obviously have a bias, right? If you have an atheist come in and say they believe Jesus resurrected, you're more inclined to believe them because they don't really want to believe that. And so if they're admitting it, it's more likely to be true. Right? Well, we have Christian and non-Christian sources that attest to the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. Let's start by looking at the non-Christian sources. Several early non-Christian sources explicitly mention Jesus' death, the first of which we're going to talk about is Josephus. Right? You're going to get used to hearing about Josephus quite a bit because other than the Bible itself, Josephus is really the best historian we have when it comes to the life of the history of ancient Israel. Because Josephus, he was writing during the 1st century, right? He was a Jew himself who actually fought during the revolt between the Jews and the Romans, towards the end of the 1st century, or I guess like in the middle to late 1st century. But eventually he actually defected to the Roman side, and they employed him to write a history of the Jewish people. And so I actually have, these are all of Josephus' works right here, in this book right here, just the complete works, such as Antiquities of the Jews, the Jewish Wars. It's actually really cool whenever you actually look at his books, because he summarizes a lot of what we have in the Bible, right? So he literally writes his equivalent of Genesis, which is almost word for word in a lot of places, but he also adds in other key details, which are kind of cool because we don't know for a fact that they are true, but it does at least let us know what people in the 1st century believed about things, right? So he tells us extra details about Moses. And we read that Pharaoh's daughter was raising up Moses to be the heir to Pharaoh himself because Pharaoh didn't have a son. The Old Testament doesn't tell us that, but that's kind of cool. And it actually helps explain certain things when you read the biblical account. He also tells us that Moses was a general in Pharaoh's army, and he details this whole war between Moses and some of the other people. It's actually really cool stuff. Once again, we don't know whether or not that stuff actually happened, but it lets us know that Jews at that time period at least believed that it did, right? But whenever you actually look at Josephus's accounts, he is pretty accurate when it comes to the stuff that was happening at his time period, and he actually proves to be a very good historian, right? There's some places where he messes up, as would be expected whenever it's one man doing all this work, but by and large, he does a really good job. And this is what Josephus says is in Antiquities of the Jews. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day." So there are some things that are questionable about this. Mainly, the one thing that people question in regards to this account of Josephus is the phrase, "he was the Christ." There are some scholars who argue that that is a later addition, that maybe some Christians inserted into Josephus' text. And there might be some evidence for that, mainly because we don't have any evidence that Josephus himself was a Christian, and that statement would seem to suggest that he was. Because if he's calling Jesus the Christ, it would seem he's a Christian. More likely, he probably wrote something that along the lines of, "it was asserted that he was the Christ," or something along those lines, or maybe that phrase wasn't there. But what we know for a fact he did write is that Pilate had condemned Jesus to the cross. So not only does Josephus in the 1st century say that Jesus was condemned to the cross, but he associates it with the same prefect from Rome that the Bible does, right? So you have a Roman prefect named Pontius Pilate who condemns Jesus to the cross. That's pretty cool. All right, continuing on, we've got Tacitus. Tacitus, you will see, he is not a fan of Christians, but he says this: "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace." What he's describing here is what we talked about on Tuesday in regards to the Great Fire of Rome, right? So in AD, what was it, 64?
64.
Yeah. In AD 64, this huge fire broke out in Rome. And nobody knew who did it, but everybody speculated and had a good feeling that it was Nero, because Nero basically wanted to burn down the city so he could go about his own architectural projects. He wanted to rebuild the city in his own image. And so what we see here is that Tacitus, who is not a fan of Christians, he himself admits that Nero did set this fire, and he blamed it on the Christians, right? To get rid of the report, he fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So you can tell from his language that he is not a fan of Christians, right? He says that these groups of people were hated for their abominations, right? So he's writing from the perspective of somebody who hates Christians, right? He says these people, we don't like what they do. Some of the abominations that they probably have in mind are atheism, right? Because Christians were called atheists by the Romans, because if you think about it from the Roman perspective, Romans had thousands of gods. Christians, they asserted there was only one God. And so from our perspective, we're like, we're not atheists. But from their perspective, you're rejecting 99.999% of the gods. And so they called them atheists. They also called them incestuous. And that's because Christians went around calling each other brother and sister, right? Because they're, the body of Christ and they're family. And so they say, hey, this is my wife, Sister Cindy. And they're like, oh. So they called them incestuous. And then they also called them cannibals. And that's because of communion, right? They would say, this is the body and blood of Christ. And so in general, it seems like, the Roman people who didn't understand the practices of Christians and didn't look deeper into it, they just thought that these people were weird. They were some incestuous, atheistic cannibals. And so they were hated for their abominations. And Tacitus agrees to this, right? And then Tacitus even goes on to say that it's just a mischievous superstition that they're believing in. And he says that it's been thus checked for the moment because of the persecutions. And he even also says that the Christian belief started off in Judea, but it spread even to Rome. And he's writing this at the beginning of the 2nd century, right? That's really cool because all of the things he's saying lines up with what the New Testament itself asserts, even though Tacitus does not like Christians. And he also agrees that Pontius Pilate had Jesus crucified. That's what the extreme penalty is, right? The extreme penalty is crucifixion. It was so extreme that a Roman citizen could not themselves be crucified because it was deemed too shameful, right? That's why the Apostle Paul, historically speaking, he was not crucified like in his death. He was actually beheaded, right? Because he was a Roman citizen and therefore he could not be crucified. Instead, they would have beheaded him because it was deemed less shameful, right? But Jesus, he was crucified. He suffered the extreme penalty. Lucian says this, talking of the Christians. And they revered Jesus as a god, made use of him as a lawgiver, and set him down as a protector. Next, after that other, to be sure, whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine, because he introduced this new cult into the world. Furthermore, their first lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another after they have transgressed once, for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshiping that crucified sophist himself and living under his laws. Right? So, right here he's mocking Jesus himself. Right? He's calling him, he's saying they worship him as a god. And they view him as the lawgiver. Whereas obviously from his perspective, Rome, the emperor is the god and he is the lawgiver. Well, they view this guy as their emperor. And they don't listen to the philosophers. They listen to this sophist. A sophist is just like a wise person. Right? He's mocking Jesus and who he is, but he is agreeing that Jesus was crucified in Palestine. Once again, Palestine is just the name that the Romans gave to Israel after they destroyed it, and it was basically a way of mocking the Israelites, because if you go back to the Old Testament, the number one enemies of the Israelites were the Philistines, right? And so once Rome conquered Israel, they renamed it Palestine, right? So that's where you get Palestine from, and so that's what they call the place. And so right there, you already have three people who, from a Roman perspective, who are attesting the fact that Jesus did die a death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. But it continues. Mara Bar Serapion, I believe this is a Jewish person now because you have the word bar in there. He says this, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. So this guy is once again not a Christian, but he ties the death of Jesus to the destruction of Jerusalem, which is very interesting, right? Jesus died around AD 30 to 33, somewhere in there. And the destruction of Jerusalem didn't happen until 40 years later, right? From many people's perspective, 40 years is a whole generation. But this guy, writing towards, literally just a few years after the destruction of Jerusalem, I mean, think about that. He's writing AD 73. This is 3 years later. He's saying that destruction is a direct result and punishment of them killing their king. That's pretty cool, right? That already lets you know how fast the gospel message had spread, right? Here, I mean, we're only 3 years removed from the destruction itself, and people are already saying that there's a divine cause behind this, and they were being punished for what they did to their Messiah. It's pretty cool. And then you also have the Talmud. The Talmud is a collection of Jewish writings that was basically spliced together a few centuries after the time of Christ. We talked about this maybe last week, I think it was. When it comes to the different Jewish traditions that lasted after the destruction of the temple, do you remember which party of the Jews lived on after the temple was destroyed? You know, there's the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots. Which were the ones that existed afterwards?
May I guess Sadducees?
It was not the Sadducees.
Pharisees.
It was the Pharisees, right? Because if you remember, the Essenes, they were a monastic group, and they also didn't marry. And so they died off very quickly because they didn't repopulate. The Zealots, they were the ones who led the revolt against Rome, and so they were wiped out during the battle. The Sadducees, everything they did, they were basically the priestly class and the aristocratic class. And so whenever the temple was destroyed and Israel was basically destroyed with it, the Sadducees ceased to have any purpose or influence, right? Their wealth was gone, their function was gone, and they ceased to exist. The Pharisees were the only ones who continued to thrive. Because by the time you get to AD 70, the Pharisees had, they were less centralized in the temple, and they were more focused on the teachings in the synagogues, right? And the synagogues were all over the place, right? They weren't just in Israel, they were everywhere. And the Pharisees, they weren't focused as much on the ritual components of the law as they were on the moral components of the law. And they had developed this whole oral tradition that they'd been passing down over time, right? This is the written Torah, which is the scriptures, versus the oral Torah, right? And over time, eventually, Pharisaical Judaism becomes what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism, right? And Rabbinic just comes from the term rabbi, right? Because the Pharisees were the rabbis who were passing this stuff down. And a few centuries after the destruction in Jerusalem, since Judaism was expanding out and stuff like that, eventually they decided that they were going to codify the oral traditions. And they were going to take all the things that had orally been passed down over centuries, and they were finally going to write it down. That's what the Talmud is, right? The Talmud is basically just the written form of the oral traditions that have been passed down for centuries. And so the Talmud comes from the 4th or 5th century, but the teaching that it's reflecting dates a lot earlier, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, in the Talmud, it says this. The Gemara, which is a section of the Talmud, the Gemara raises a difficulty. But isn't it taught in a Baraita? On Passover Eve, they hung the corpse of Jesus the Nazarene after they killed him by way of stoning. And a crier went out before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming, Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. What do y'all notice in this passage?
It doesn't say he was crucified.
It doesn't say he was crucified. And if you can believe it, this is actually evidence for the crucifixion. This is actually really, this is really neat if you just think through the logic of this for a moment. All right. So, once again, this is being written down centuries later, right? Let's look at the details that it does say consistently. It says that Jesus was crucified, or it says that he was killed, right? And who does it say he was killed by?
By way of stoning.
Yeah, but by who?
Jewish people.
It doesn't mention who, right? It doesn't say anybody, right? The other accounts mention Pontius Pilate. This doesn't mention Rome at all, right? It mentions Passover Eve, which does line up with what we read about in Scripture, right? Jesus dies on the eve of the Passover. Remember, that's why they had to get his body off the cross, because they wanted it down before Passover began? Okay, so it gets the date correct, which means that there was a tradition that Jesus was killed on Passover Eve. But it doesn't mention who killed him. And so it seems like what this person is passing along is that the Jewish people killed him. Because think about it. Would the Romans kill somebody for sorcery? The Romans don't really care, right? From the Roman perspective, all the Jews are practicing sorcery and they just didn't want to mess with them, right? The only thing the Romans cared about is if the Jews thought that they had a new king in town, and that's why they killed Jesus for being a king. They didn't care if there was some guy going around claiming to be a prophet. Who does care about that?
The Jews.
The Jewish people. right? Because from their perspective, Jesus being a false prophet. All right, well, if you go back to the Old Testament, what is the punishment for false prophecy?
Yeah.
Death. And in particular, how do Jewish people typically kill people? By stoning, right? Stoning is typically the manner of death for Jewish people. And so, if you were a Jewish person a few centuries removed from this, and you knew that there was a teaching, that there was this guy named Jesus of Nazareth, who the people believed to be a false prophet, and so they executed him, you would naturally assume that he had been killed in what way? By stoning. This is what's really cool, because whenever you look at the New Testament texts, there's a little comment made in one of the Gospels, I think it's the Gospel of John, where the Jews explain that at this time period, the Romans had taken away their right to capital punishment. And so they had to hand Jesus over to Pilate to be crucified. But we don't have any evidence for that outside of the Gospels themselves. And so it would seem to suggest that this was just for a very short amount of time. And so it would also follow that somebody who was recording this later on wouldn't have known about that custom, and therefore they would have just assumed, oh, if the Jews had somebody put to death, it would have been by stoning. Whereas this is where the Gospels themselves actually shed light on something that helps explain all of this, right? Because the earlier accounts all agree that Jesus died a death by crucifixion. And then you have this one way later written by a Jewish person who says, no, it was by stoning. Well, that makes sense. Because a Jewish person wouldn't naturally assume that a false prophet in Israel would be crucified. They would assume, oh, well, if he was a false prophet, the Jews would have put him to death by stoning. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, this is like one of my favorite ones, because at first you look at it and you're like, oh no, that's not crucifixion. But you could also see how this would develop over time, right? And once again, that doesn't necessarily mean that, if you're just looking at it at face value, you do have one argument that is suggesting that he wasn't crucified, right? That's true. But there's an explainable, like you can explain why that would be, and also, even if he wasn't crucified, what do all these have in common?
Death.
That he died,
Yeah.
right? And ultimately, his death is the main thing that matters when it comes to his resurrection. But the cool thing is that the earliest accounts tell us that he was crucified. And then it's only a later account that says that he was stoned, and that later account, you can easily understand how they would have arrived at that conclusion if they didn't have a detailed, if they didn't have an oral tradition explaining what the Romans had done at that time period. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, cool. And so, there are all our non-Christian sources. There's other ones later on, but we're mainly looking at the earliest sources we have. And so, let's look at the Christian sources. Right? As would be expected, several early Christian sources also mention Jesus' death, and they go into way more detail about it than the non-Christian sources do, just because obviously Christians care more about Jesus than a non-Christian would. And so, in the New Testament itself, before the Gospels were written, Paul himself makes abundant references to Christ's death. Right? This is something that we kind of take for granted, but you got to remember that the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were not the first New Testament books that were written, most likely. There is an argument you can make that maybe Matthew was written earlier. That's what I argued in my master's thesis for seminary, but that is not the majority opinion. The majority opinion is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the earliest ones were written until around AD 60 or late 50s, right? Whereas we have several of Paul's letters, which we can date to the early 50s, if not late 40s, right? What's really cool is that Paul himself, look at all those references. He mentions that Jesus died several times, and he specifically mentions that Jesus died a death by crucifixion in several other occasions, right? All of which are letters that were written prior to the writing of most of the Gospels. That's pretty cool. Because in those letters, he doesn't feel the need to explain the story, right? He's assuming that his audience has already heard this, which implies that this was a belief that was held prior to him writing it. Does that make sense? All right. And then the Gospels themselves provide our most in-depth narratives concerning Christ's crucifixion and death. If you go to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, you will see that there is a detailed account of his death in all of those. And all of them agree that he did die a death by crucifixion. Other books, such as Hebrews and 1 Peter, also make references to Jesus' death. The main reason I mention those separately is because we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. And we have a good feeling that Peter wrote the book of 1 Peter. But it's also very likely that those were written after the Gospels. And so you could always argue that these were simply picking up stuff that they heard in the Gospels or read in one of Paul's letters. But it's still unlikely, right? These are all such early texts that it just seems to be passing down the tradition that the early church believed about Jesus. Make sense? All right, cool. And then if you actually go to non-canonical literature, so stuff that's found outside of the Bible, you also have early references to Christ's death. Not once again, because we haven't talked about this in a while, but not all of these books are necessarily books that we would agree with as Christians, right? Because some of these books, the reason they're not in the canon, all of these books, the reason they're not in the canon is because they're not written by an apostle or through apostolic authority, but some of them are just outright heretical books. But since we're simply viewing this from the perspective of a historian, it doesn't matter if a book is heretical, right? We are simply viewing it as a historical resource, in a historical document, in a historical text. Does that make sense? So, whether it's heretical or not does not matter. As long as it is talking about a guy named Jesus, who was from Nazareth, who was a preacher that people knew, and he was crucified, that's what matters. Several of the apostolic fathers report that Jesus did die a death by crucifixion. The apostolic fathers are people that we would say do have pretty good teachings. You can access their books. Usually, I've got one cool version that's like, it's Greek and English together. And their texts are from the late 1st century to early 2nd century. Some of these books were probably written during the same time period that some of the books of the Bible were written. It's actually really cool. And so if you go look at those, you will see several references to Jesus' death by crucifixion. The Gospel of the Hebrews mentions his bodily resurrection. That doesn't directly mention that he died, but it implies that he did, because it makes it very clear that this was not simply like a spiritual resurrection or anything like that. It was a bodily resurrection, which implies that there was a bodily death that preceded it. The Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Truth mention his death, while the Gospel of the Savior mentioned his crucifixion. Those are both books that I would encourage you to not check out too much because they are weird. I guess you can read them if you want a good laugh, but they're very strange books. And the Gnostic Coptic Apocalypse of Peter and the second treatise of the Great Seth depict Jesus' crucifixion and death. These books, if you read their depictions of Jesus' death, they're weird and wonky, and they're very strange, but as a historian, all that matters is that they do agree that Jesus died a death by crucifixion, right? We're not, at this point, we're not even trying to see if all the things reconcile. We are simply looking at it and saying, there's a lot of evidence that agrees he died a death by crucifixion. That's what ultimately matters, right? If there's other cursory details that are different, okay, we'll deal with that later. Right now, we're trying to figure out what's historical bedrock. And so, you have all that. And in addition to all of that stuff, here's the best part, there is no evidence to the contrary. Right? There is not a single piece of evidence from our earliest documents which would suggest Jesus did not die a death. Well, I guess that he was not killed. Right? There is at least one source that says he died by stoning rather than crucifixion, but every single one of them agrees that he was put to death, right, under criminal charges. Right? All of them agree on at least that. And so whenever somebody brings up the whole swoon theory, you've got to realize that they are not practicing history in that moment. Right? What they are doing is they are being ahistorical. Right? They are simply speculating. Because whenever you say, oh, Jesus didn't die on the cross, he simply passed out, you have stepped out of historical practice and you have stepped into just empty speculation. Because you are no longer allowing the historical evidence to lead you to your conclusions. You're allowing your biases to lead you. Does that make sense? Right? We don't want that to be our case. We want to let the evidence lead us to the conclusion. And so, Jesus died a death by crucifixion. Right? But that's simply the multiple attestation, right? There's also other stuff we're going to look at in a second. But if you're just looking at the sheer quantity of reports that we already have really good evidence that he did die a death by crucifixion. I also think, I'm trying to remember, I believe that Muslims also hold that Jesus did not actually die. I'm trying to remember exactly what their belief is. I don't remember if they believe somebody...
I think they believe the swoon theory.
Is it the swoon theory? I couldn't remember if they believed the swoon theory or if they believed that, he switched out with somebody for him or something like that. I couldn't remember. Sometimes people... Yeah. But whoever believes the swoon theory, you've got to realize there's no historical evidence for it. Right? It's simply speculation and it's being blinded by one's own bias. And so, second thing, early attestation. A second evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion is that the reports are early. The cool thing, the entire New Testament was completed by the end of the 1st century, AD. That's really cool. Especially whenever you just think about who Jesus was. he is, he's just like a homeless rabbi from the middle of nowhere who drew up a following, and then by the end of the first century, right, 70 years after he had died, there are already 27 different books testifying to him. That's cool, right? And, as Christians, we view these books as the Word of God, which is cool, but just from a historical perspective, that already should set off some warning bells, because that lets you know that at the very least, this guy is significant, right? Which is weird given where he came from, right? We have no reason to believe that he had an advanced education, right? He seems to have come from a relatively poor family. His dad seemed to have died at a relatively young age. And so it seems like he kind of rose from obscurity, yet somehow amassed this great following, despite the fact that all the reports testify to the fact that he also died at a young age. That's weird, right? Because if you think about it, he didn't really accomplish that much, right? He had like a 3.5-year-long ministry, which ended in death, according to most of the reports. So why is it that within 70 years after his death, there's 27 different historical documents just within the Bible itself that testify to him, right? And then you have the other extra-biblical books, which are also being written during that time period and also afterwards. Paul mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion no later than AD 55, and he says that he preached the same message to the Corinthians in AD 51. One thing you have to know about these dates is that I'm being conservative with the dates, right? And so, whenever I say AD 55, in all likelihood, it's actually earlier than that, right? But what I like to do is I like to give the best arguments to the opposing side, right? Let's just assume that our dating system is totally wrong. Let's assume the latest dates possible, just because I just think that's a better practice, right? I don't want to overstate our cause. I want to understate it, if anything, right? Because even if you understate it, I think we have really good evidence. And so, like 1 Corinthians and Galatians, Galatians most likely was written far earlier than AD 55. And Paul mentions the death of Christ in Galatians. But let's just assume it's written later, right? No later than AD 55. We know for a fact it had to be written by then. He does mention Jesus' death by crucifixion. But what's really cool is that in 1 Corinthians, when he mentions it to them, we're going to talk about this week. Like, there's a passage in 1 Corinthians 15 you're going to get tired of hearing because it's so essential to this whole argument. But in 1 Corinthians 15, whenever Paul mentions the death of Jesus, he mentions that he actually preached about the death of Jesus to the Corinthians earlier. And we can look at, the account of Paul's life in the book of Acts, and we can figure out the chronology of Paul's life, and we know that the time that he had to be preaching to the Corinthians was in AD 51. That's cool, because that jumps us back 4 years earlier, right? And if Jesus died between AD 30 and 33, we're now dealing with less than 2 decades from the event to the actual report here, and that's within what we would call living memory, right? What is living memory?
It's
I've never heard that term before.
I have. In a historical sense, it's essentially what is possible for people to remember at the earliest.
Yeah, so living memory basically means that there are still plenty of people who are alive who would be able to argue against the fact, right? So if Paul in AD 51 is going around reporting that Jesus died of death by crucifixion, well, that's only 20 years after the events. There would be plenty of people who would be able to easily say, no, he didn't, right? But it gets even better than that. It appears several times, so the death of Jesus, it appears several times in the early church kerygma, which is just a fancy word meaning proclamations, and in the oral formulas of the early church, the earliest of which is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3, written around AD 54, which many scholars believe contain teachings dating back to the early 30s AD, within a few years or even a few months of Christ's death. In parentheses there, I've just let you know the different scholars who date the things to that time, if you want to go actually look into their work and figure out why they dated those times. But it goes to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and basically what you can do is you can look at what he's saying here, and there's a certain cadence to what he's saying, to where how he's reporting it makes it very clear that this was something that was passed down as a teaching. Like, it was like an oral formula. You know how we have like songs and stuff that we sing? It's almost like this was an early church creed that was passed along. And so in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scripture." and that he was buried, and that he rose after 3 days in accordance with the scriptures. He goes on and talks about a lot of stuff. Like I said, we're going to be looking at this passage in depth a lot later over the course of the next few weeks because it's super cool. But just follow the logic of what he says. Right? So he is writing in AD 54 to the Corinthians. And he says that he delivered to them as of first importance. Well, if it's of first importance, that means that he delivered it to them the first time that he visited them, which would be AD 51 according to the book of Acts, right? Whenever you line up the chronology. But he doesn't say that the thing that he passed along was something that originated with him. No, he says he delivered to them as of first importance what he also received, right? So this teaching that he gave to them is something that he received from somebody else. Okay, well, if the Apostle Paul is receiving a key Christian message from somebody, who's it going to be from? Is it going to be from Joe, the random Hittite walking down the street? No, who's it going to be from?
Somebody living during that time? Close?
Just some random person?
Nope.
Likely early members of the church.
Yeah, specifically an apostle,
Yep.
right? It would have to be a leading member of the church, right? And if Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, well, then he presumably would have gone to Jerusalem to make sure that his teachings lined up with them. And the cool thing is, whenever you look at the book of Acts, that's exactly what Paul did after he came to Christ, right? He persecuted the early church. Once again, people speculate between if Jesus died in AD 30 or 33. I lean towards the AD 30 date, but practically most people agree that Paul got converted around AD 34, right? So it could be that he persecuted the church for a few years. It could be just a few months. We don't know. But it seems to be that he came to Christ around AD 34, and that would have been when he went down to Jerusalem for the first time and received from them what was of first importance. And that would have been these teachings, right? And most likely he'd already heard them before, but what he's communicating in 1 Corinthians is that this is the authoritative teachings of the apostles, right? He's saying, I gave to you what was authoritatively given to me. And so we have good reason to believe that what he is teaching them in 1 Corinthians is something that was given to him back in AD 34, within 1 to 4 years of the actual crucifixion of Jesus. Like, that is well within living memory, right? And if he received it from Jerusalem, well, guess where Jesus was crucified? Jerusalem. And so if this was the authoritative teaching of the church in Jerusalem within a few years after Christ's death, well, that would seem to suggest that everybody in Jerusalem recognized that it was true, because all you would have to do is people say, he was never crucified. No, we know that Jesus guy. He's still living down in Nazareth, right? Or no, he died by stoning, but nobody argued this apparently, right? This is what the early Jerusalem church taught. And once again, if you want to actually look into the evidence for why we believe it's that early, you can go look more in depth at those other people's accounts, like those other people's work. But for right now, I just want to highlight that. And so, not only do we have a lot of evidence suggesting this stuff happened, but the evidence that we have is very early, which is really encouraging for us, right? It's not like we just have, 5 people from a week ago who are being like, hey, 2,000 years ago, some Jewish dude was killed. That's not what it is. No, we have credible evidence that tells us that Jesus died a death by crucifixion, and it comes from within the first few decades to the first few years or even months of his actual death, which is really neat from just a historical perspective. It's very rare that you actually have accounts from that early on, even with really big historical figures, right? I don't know. I want to look into this. For people like Julius Caesar and stuff like that, I would want to look into like how early on were their earliest biographies written, right? That'd just be kind of cool to look into. And then keep in mind that Julius Caesar was an emperor. Well, I guess he wasn't an emperor, but the people after him were emperors. But I don't know. That'd be interesting to look at just in comparison, because by comparison, Jesus really wasn't as significant. All right, evidence number 3, credible attestation. A third evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion is that the passion narratives appear largely credible given their satisfying of the criterion of embarrassment and the plausibility of certain peripheral details. All right. These are things we talked about last week. Let me see if I can... really only 2 of y'all were here last week, but let me see if I can test you to see if you know what this is talking about. Do y'all remember what the criterion of embarrassment is?
When somebody says something embarrassing that they're not saying to make themselves look good at all, but is rather just,
Yeah, so whenever somebody reports something that is embarrassing, it's more likely to be true, right? If I were to tell you that you didn't know this, but I was actually a 3-time Oscar winner, and I'd also won 5 Golden Globes and the Summer Olympics for 12 years in a row. Most likely that's all false, right? Because I have every reason to make that stuff up because it makes me look super good, and it just also makes for a good story. However, if I told you that last year I passed out and my mom discovered me covered in vomit and blood, well, that most likely is true because doesn't make me look very good at all. It makes me look kind of gross and weird and pathetic, right? And so, one of those stories is more likely to be true. I was kind of just throwing myself under the bus there, and I guess I could have just made up something. But whenever you're reporting a historical account, people are more inclined to make themselves look good, right? Imagine you're writing like an autobiography of yourself, right? You're more likely to highlight your best moments, right? You're more likely to say, "Oh yeah, you're more likely to talk about like your achievements." I know, like this is naturally how things happen. Like I don't know, I used to write blog posts for like the races I used to run. And during the race, it just felt like another race. But whenever I was writing it afterwards, man, it was like every moment was just like taken to a 10. And it was like, and I picked up the heavy bag and I threw it on my shoulder and I was buckling under the weight. Like things naturally just become more massive, right? And it's harder for us to admit things that are embarrassing unless they're actually true and necessary for understanding the story. And so in general, whenever a historical account reports something that makes the teller of the story embarrassing, it's more likely to be true. And we see that within the Passion narratives. We're going to be coming back to this quite a bit throughout this several-week series. But let's talk about it. So the criterion of embarrassment. In contrast to other accounts of Jewish martyrs bravely enduring torture and execution, the Gospels depict Jesus as weak and far less valiant in comparison. The embarrassing elements weigh in favor of the historicity that in the Gospels we are reading authentic reports of Christ's death. What I mean by that is this. Think about just stories where people go about noble self-sacrifice, right? When people die martyrs' deaths, you tend to tell those stories in ways that make the people look really good. You don't want to make them look weak because you want to honor their sacrifice, right? That's natural. And whenever you look at other Jewish accounts of people being persecuted or suffering or facing martyrs' deaths, I mean, you do see that temptation to elevate the person present. Right? Whenever you look at the Maccabees and stuff, whenever they die, they march boldly into death, and they smile at death, and they greet him as an old friend, and they lay their lives down with their head held high and their chin lifted to the sky. And that's typically what you would expect. Think about Stephen in the book of Acts, right? I think that Stephen's death, obviously, is a historical account, but whenever you look at that account, you'll notice that Stephen never looks weak. Right? Even as Stephen is being pelted with stones, he looks up to heaven and he says, "Lord, forgive them." Like, it makes him look really good. And so I believe it's a historical account, but if you're coming from a skeptical perspective, you could see how somebody might think that that was fabricated, right? Because it really just makes Stephen look like a really good guy. But now think about who Jesus is. Jesus is the Savior of the universe. According to the Christian belief, he's the God of this world. Yet whenever you look at the Gospels, they don't depict Jesus as marching boldly to death without, fear in his body. No, it's actually the exact opposite, right? Jesus is terrified, right? And every single one of the Gospels makes this clear, right? Whenever you look at the Gospel of John, he says, "What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour?" No, it's for this hour that I came into the world. Like, Jesus is terrified, and he wants to ask God to free him, but he also knows he can't, right? Whenever you go to the Gospel of Luke, or really Matthew and Mark as well, Jesus falls on his face and he says, "Father, if it be possible, remove this cup from me. Not my will, but yours be done." And so Jesus is being depicted in a very weak manner, right? Here you have the God of the universe and the Savior of the world, yet here he is a few hours from his death, and he is begging for any way out. That isn't typically how you depict your heroes of the story, right? And if the gospel writers chose to depict him that way, it would seem to suggest that they're just reporting what actually happened, right? They're not making this stuff up, because if you were just making this stuff up, you would really depict Jesus as just, being like, "All right, guys, we're going to the Garden of Gethsemane." And then he just sits there and waits for Judas to arrive, boldly talking with the disciples. But that's not what happens. Instead, you see Jesus broken. According to the Gospel of Luke, he's so stressed out that he's sweating blood, right? He is depicted as weak and frail. Whenever he's on the cross, he quotes Psalm 22, and what does he say?
My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? If you're making this stuff up, you usually don't depict the hero of the story that way. Especially if you're going to be arguing that the hero of the story is the God of the universe. Because you're making your God look awfully weak. Which is another reason why, the early Christians were, put to shame. Right? They were mocked for what they believed about Jesus. Fun fact about this, if you actually go on Google sometime, look up the earliest artwork depicting Jesus. The earliest artwork depicting Jesus, it actually isn't from a Christian at all. It's from somebody who is mocking Jesus. And I forget what the inscription says. It says something like, I think it says like the Christians worshiping their God. And it's a person on a cross, but he has the head of a donkey. And they're making fun of Christians because they're saying, who worships a God who is crucified? That's so embarrassing, right? Because, once again, from their perspective, crucifixion is the most shameful death you can die. And so, this is why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Because he realizes there is an element of shame that comes to this. You are saying that the God who created the universe, who you worship, took on the form of a man. He trembled in the face of death, yet he boldly went on to die. But he died a very shameful death, where he was stripped of his clothes, he was beaten, his organs were practically falling out, and he died a death crying out, asking God why he'd forsaken him. And it sounds kind of embarrassing. And so whenever you compare that to other accounts of Jewish martyrs, it would actually suggest that Jesus' death did actually happen, because it fulfills the criterion of embarrassment. Because you wouldn't make this stuff up unless it actually happened. In which case you're not making it up, you're simply telling the truth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. But the criterion of embarrassment isn't the only thing that makes this credible, right? That would be enough, I would argue, but it goes beyond that. There's also a number of details in the canonical Gospels pertaining to Jesus' execution that possess plausibility, although these are in the peripherals. Although not strong evidence when considered in isolation, the plausibility of numerous details in the reports possess weight when considered in light of the other evidences weighing in favor of historicity. What that means is this. There are certain details when you're reading through the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion that aren't key details that stand out, but they're almost like just like side details, peripherals, right? Like peripheral vision over here.
Right.
They're like little side details that are included in the accounts that would seem to suggest that this is reporting an actual event of a person being crucified. And they're not so out there and straightforward that you could argue, this is just the author of the gospel trying to include details to make it seem authentic. No, they're just subtle enough and just obscure enough that it just works out. And I'll explain. You'll understand more of what I'm saying when we list some examples. For instance, Lucian, remember how we mentioned Lucian earlier? He was one of the non-Christian sources who mentioned Jesus. Lucian, he mentions crowds following criminals on their way to crucifixion, similar to how Luke describes the crowds following Jesus. That's a super small detail, right? There's nothing really significant about crowds following Jesus other than the fact that it seems like there were enough people here who probably could have stopped him from being crucified, yet they still just willingly allowed him to be crucified and followed him to his death, right? So there's really nothing big about that detail in the Gospel of Luke, and there's really nothing about that detail in particular that, like if you're, like hypothetically, let's say that Luke was fabricating his story, right? Let's start from that perspective. If Luke was fabricating his story, what would he gain by mentioning that crowds followed after Jesus? Nothing really, right? Because you can leave that detail there or you can take it out, and that's not really going to argue much in regards to the historicity of the crucifixion until we happen to come across another historical document which just happens to mention that this was a practice at that time. Well, that's really cool. Luke didn't necessarily know that people would be looking at these documents side by side, and so it's not like he was trying to corroborate his account with Lucian's. And Lucian definitely wasn't trying to corroborate his with Luke's. They simply both reported these two details. Lucian mentions that this was a practice, and Luke mentions that it happened to happen. And so it could be that Luke just happened to stumble across something that happened to be true, or more likely, this was actually a historical event. And as Luke reports what he was told, people told him that there was a crowd following Jesus. That makes sense?
Yes.
All right. John reports that Romans broke the legs of the thieves on the cross so that they would die quickly in efforts to remove the bodies before the Sabbath. the practice of breaking legs of crucified victims is reported by Cicero. In the Gospel of Peter, breaking legs was forbidden so victims would suffer longer. In 1968, the skeletal remains of a crucified victim were discovered and one of his shins had been smashed. This is another cool detail, right? You feel bad for that guy whose shins were discovered, but it's really cool for us from a historical perspective because this lets us know that this was an actual practice, right? John just mentions, oh yeah, they needed to take the thieves off the cross, and so they broke their shins. And, even if we didn't have any historical details, well, that's kind of cool. I mean, I don't know, like it makes sense, right? They're wanting to break their shins so that they can't lift themselves up anymore, and therefore they would die from suffocation, right? That's what they're trying to accomplish. It makes sense. But then you do have these other historical accounts which report that, yeah, that's exactly what they did when they were trying to remove the bodies. And he's not saying this about Jesus, remember, right? John isn't saying that they broke Jesus' shins. He's saying that they broke the thieves to the side shins, right? So this really doesn't have any theological implications in regards to Jesus, other than the fact that John does highlight that his shins couldn't be broken because it fulfilled a prophecy saying that, like a lamb, like whenever an unblemished Passover lamb was given, it couldn't have a broken bone. And so there are theological implications for Jesus' legs not being broken, but John didn't have to highlight that, right? He could have simply just not mentioned the thieves' legs being broken at all and just moved along and not even drawn attention to it. But instead he says, oh, no, let me tell you, the other guys, their legs were broken, and Jesus' was not because that fulfilled prophecy. And then you actually go look, and sure enough, that was a practice. And so it's not like John was just making this practice up in order to help Jesus fulfill prophecy. No, there was actually an actual practice of this. And then, as recently as within the last 60 years, people discover, was that 60 years ago? 1968? 78, 98, 2008? Yeah. So, within the last 60 years, we actually have skeletal remains being discovered that prove this to be a fact. That's cool, right? So it's not like John was just making this up to fulfill prophecy. No. This was the thing that actually happened, right? Although Romans often left crucified victims on the cross for a while after death to be food for the animals, Josephus reports that up until AD 67 or 68, Jerusalem was the exception, with Jews removing and burying their dead prior to the sunset. John's account of Christ's death details just such a case. This is also really cool, right? Because all the other accounts that we have tell us that, Romans didn't care. Typically the reason why Romans crucified people was to prove a point. And so typically they wanted the bodies up there for a really long time. And so if somebody was arguing and saying, hey, we want that body down, typically the Romans would say, we don't care, we're leaving it up. However, Josephus tells us there was an exception with the Jews. Because once again, the Romans knew that the Jews were more likely to revolt, and so they did want to keep the Jews happy as much as possible. And so Josephus mentions, oh no, Jerusalem was the exception, right? In other cities, they might have left the bodies up. But in the holy city of Jerusalem, they did take an exception, and they did allow the bodies to be taken down before sunset, which is exactly what John mentions in his gospel. But what's also cool about that is, think about this if we didn't have Josephus' account. If we didn't have Josephus' account, we'd kind of be scratching our heads. Because we'd be like, according to all the other accounts, the Romans did not care about what happened to crucified victims, right? They would have just left them up. And then we would be looking at John's gospel and we'd be saying, okay, maybe John's making this up. But then you happen to come across Josephus' account, which explains, no, this is exactly what they did. What's cool about that is that Josephus is writing after the time period of the gospel is being written, and he's not somebody who is himself a Christian, so he would have no reason to fabricate this. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's also really cool. Quintilian reports that as for those who die on the cross, the executioner does not forbid the burying of those who have been pierced. This is consistent with the account of Christ's crucifixion, where upon seeing Jesus was already dead, he was pierced rather than having his legs broken. So we see from this other account that people would be buried after they had been pierced in the side and they had proven that they were dead, right? So typically the Romans did not, they didn't just take the body off the cross and just bury it alive or something like that, and they didn't bury them they didn't kill them other ways. Once you were on the cross, you were on there until you died. If they needed to speed up the death, like we saw before, they would break the shins. But if the person had already died and they had pierced them, then they could bury them. Sure enough, that's exactly what we read about in the Gospels. Right? Whenever they go to break the legs of the victims, they realize that Jesus is already dead. So what do? They take a spear and they pierce him. And it says that water and blood come flowing out. And that basically confirms that they got all the way to the heart and that he was dead. Right? It confirms that they're dead. So that's also a cool detail. John cites many prophecies as being fulfilled at Jesus' crucifixion, but here's the cool thing. None of these texts were originally messianic, but such practices were all plausible at Roman executions, suggesting that John's associations come from actual historical experiences which he then gained better understanding of through the study of Scripture. Real quick, y'all have y'all's Bibles?
I do.
Yes.
All right, let's get people to flip. Paul, could you flip for me to Psalm 22:18?
All right.
Ben, could you go to Psalm 34:20? And then, Nick, could you go to Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10 for me?
34:20.
Oh, I turned right too.
Nice.
I might need there's Psalm, okay. Verse 22:18, right?
22:18, yeah.
Yes.
Could you read it for me?
Okay, 18 is right here. They divide my clothing among them and cast lots for my garment.
All right. Very good. Cool. So, right there. They divide my clothing among them, they cast lots for my garments. So there's a few cool things just about that passage. First off, that is Psalm 22, which is the passage that Jesus himself quotes from the cross. Right? When he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is Psalm 22:1. And so, imagine you're John watching this happen. Right? Jesus quotes this psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me? And keep in mind, the Psalms were originally music. This is basically the equivalent of somebody saying, never going to give you up. All of a sudden in your head, you're thinking, never going to let you down. Like you start singing through the rest of the song. All right, so John hears Jesus say, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And as he begins hearing the rest of the song in his head, he's looking around and he's seeing the actual prophecies being fulfilled before him. And the reason we would say that's more historically accurate is because Psalm 22 doesn't read like a messianic psalm. Right? There are other prophecies in Scripture which are clearly messianic. Right? When you go to Psalm chapter, like the second Psalm, that's very clearly messianic. When you go to Psalm 118, that's clearly messianic. Whenever you go to other passages like certain passages in Isaiah and stuff, there's some that are very clearly messianic. Psalm 22, it just sounds like David is having the worst day of his life. You would never associate that with the Messiah. But what we do know is that there is historical evidence that Romans would divide garments and cast lots for the clothing of the criminals. And so that lines up, right? It's almost like this isn't, like John doesn't gain anything by forcing this prophecy just because it's not going to confirm anything to anybody because they didn't view that as messianic, right? You need better arguments than that. You need to show how Jesus fulfilled an explicitly messianic prophecy, right? Quoting this prophecy, that's just like the icing on the cake, right? This isn't one that's going to convince somebody to follow Jesus. This is one that's going to convince somebody who's already following Jesus that he was the guy, right? It's like, dude, even this part that we didn't even think it was messianic, turns out it was messianic too, right? Think about how much more of Scripture that we didn't know was about Jesus was actually about Jesus. That's kind of what this is arguing. All right, Psalm 34.
For the Lord protects the bones of the righteous, not one of them is broken.
Yeah, so once again, does it say the Lord protects the bones of the Messiah? No, it just says the righteous, right? And there's a lot of righteous people who have had broken bones, right? And so in general, Psalm 34 doesn't even seem like it's giving like a blanket statement of like, hey, God's never going to allow a righteous person to have a broken bone. Or else we would have to assume that everybody who's ever broken a bone is just wicked in the eyes of God. Well, no, right? It seems like it's just giving a general principle that God is more inclined to help out the righteous person. But then with Jesus, you literally have a guy who has never broken a bone, and he is literally the righteous one. And John's like, I guess that was more literal than I thought. There has only ever been one truly righteous person on earth, and he never had a broken bone. Cool. It's like, so once again, if Jesus' legs, like if the only thing that was true about Jesus from a messianic perspective was that his bones would never be broken, that would never convince anybody. Because you'd be like, and? Cool. There's a lot of people who've never had broken bones. But it's icing on the cake. And the fact that John mentions it shows that this is something that he thought after the fact, which reports that it's something that happened there. Right? Because it's not something he would make up, right? Like, because he doesn't gain anything from making it up. It's almost like he just saw something happen, and he's like, whoa, there's a Bible verse for that. I would argue this is the same thing with the virgin birth. I would argue that when you go to Isaiah chapter 7 and you read that passage, you would never assume that it's talking about the Messiah being born from a virgin. However, if you hear that there's this dude who was born from a virgin, you're probably going to be like, is there any biblical precedent for this? And then you go back and read, you're like, oh, okay, cool. And so it would seem to suggest that the historical event actually occurred, and then they went back to see if there was a defense. All right, Zechariah.
And I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn.
Perfect. Thank you. So that's interesting, because it says, like, this is God speaking, and God says that over the people of Israel, he will pour out this bitter grief because they will look on him whom they have pierced. Now, the him in that passage is very unclear. Is the him whom they have pierced God? Or is it somebody he's talking about? Well, it'd be kind of weird if it was God who they pierced. How would that even happen? Well, John's over here like, I think I figured it out. Because, like, in the Jewish mind, it's unfathomable that God would be pierced. And so, if God is just referring to him as somebody else, you could only assume that it's the Messiah, but why would the Jewish people reject their Messiah? Really, either interpretation is hard to understand. Like, why would they reject their God? Why would they reject their Messiah? Well, right here, it's both. It is their God and their Messiah whom they have pierced. Which is also weird, because if you think about it, is it the Jews that crucified Jesus? No. It was the Romans. However, whenever Pilate washed his hands of his blood, which once again, that doesn't actually make him innocent. That's just him being a coward. But remember what the Jewish people said? His blood be on us and our children to the 1000th generation. And so even though the Romans are the ones who pierced him, literally, the Jews took responsibility for it. And so they are literally looking on him whom they have pierced. And what was the rest of that? Like after the whom they have pierced thing? Like in that passage? Oh, if you don't have it, that's okay. I was trying to remember what the actual, like the rest of it was.
So, after the part where they pierce him?
Yeah.
It says, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn.
All right, that's what it was. So you have them looking on him whom they've pierced, and they mourn for him as for an only son. And as for a firstborn, right, as an heir. Well, whenever you go to the Gospel of John, God so loved the world that he sent his only son, right? And so, once again, if you go back to Zechariah's passage, it's confusing who this is talking about. And so, if you're just fabricating, like, a Messiah story, that's not a passage you're going to go to because it's too tricky, right? You want to pick one that is very clearly the Messiah. But it makes sense if John saw something historically happen, and then upon years of reflection, it's beginning to make more sense in his head, right? That doesn't prove that Jesus is the Messiah, but it does, from a historical perspective, suggest that the events that John is recording did historically happen, right? It doesn't prove that it was actually a fulfillment of prophecy. Do you understand why I'm saying that? Right? Because you could always argue that John did fabricate this later. But it's arguing that the historical events which he used to fabricate it did actually happen. Because if they didn't actually happen, he would have never even thought to fabricate those because those aren't passages you would immediately jump to. Right? It would make sense for him to say, like, I need to make up a story about Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. Because that's a clearly messianic passage. Right? You can make up a story like that. You wouldn't make up a story about Jesus' legs not being broken because you would never even think that the Messiah couldn't have a broken leg. Right? And so it's more likely he didn't have a broken leg, and then later on they brought that up. Right? And so from a historical perspective, you don't have to believe in prophecy to look at this and say, that's probably actual, like, this is what actually happened. Right? That's what we're looking at, right? We're not trying to suggest that Jesus did actually fulfill prophecy. We do believe he did, obviously, as Christians. We're simply saying that as a historian, you look at this, and it seems to suggest that John is accurately reporting what he saw, right? And that's the same thing with Luke, right? Luke, from the reports that he heard, there was a crowd following Jesus. That would seem to suggest there was actually a crowd there. Make sense?
Mm.
Cool. And so, quick review, let me test you. 3 types of attestation that we've had so far. What's the first one? Multiple attestation. Second one? Early. And now third one? Credible attestation. Right? So we've got a lot of them. They're very early, and we have good reason to believe that the people who were writing them down were acting as accurate historians. Now comes the fourth one, the probability of surviving crucifixion, if I can get this to load for me. There we go. A fourth evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion is the very low probability of surviving crucifixion. Only one account, I mentioned this earlier, only one account exists in antiquity of a person surviving crucifixion. This is from Josephus. In the story, 3 men were crucified and only to be removed extremely quickly and offered the best possible medical care. Even then, 2 of 3 died. So keep that in mind. 3 men crucified, and then very quickly after the crucifixion, all 3 of them were removed, and they were given the best possible medical care, yet even then, 2 of them died. Only 1 survived. This is what he says. Josephus is recounting his own narrative. I saw many captives crucified, and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind, and went with tears in my eyes to Titus, and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down, and to have the greatest care taken of them in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered. That's the only historical account that we have of anybody surviving crucifixion. Any other evidence that we have, every single person who's crucified dies. The only occasion that we have is of 3 people being removed immediately, and even after being offered the best possible medical care, only 1 survives. That would suggest that when you are crucified, it is a death sentence. Once again, refuting the swoon theory. Right? Because there's no evidence of Jesus being removed from the cross alive, much less being offered medical care. Right? Every report that we have says that Jesus was crucified and he died on the cross. And if he was removed from the cross, we don't know of anybody who would be able to offer him medical care that would have saved him. And we would actually argue, and we're going to be talking about this in a second, by the time Jesus even got to the cross, he was so weak that, he was already, he probably had done most of the suffering by the time he got there. Jesus only lasted 6 hours on the cross. Most people lasted multiple days. So the fact that Jesus died after only 6 hours would suggest that he was either super weakened by the time he got there, which there's evidence of, or that he supernaturally chose when he was going to die, which also is plausible from our perspective. But from a historical perspective, we would just say that it would lead to suggest that he, was very weak. So let's talk about the crucifixion process, because if you understand this, you'll see why it's so unlikely somebody would survive. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's going to get a little bit gruesome and gory here. And so as we go through this, I would hope that we're not simply using this as an academic thing. I want us to also reflect on what Jesus went through for us, right? Because yes, we're viewing this from a historical perspective, which is naturally scholarly and academic in nature, but since we are Christians, I do want us to just reflect on the fact that Jesus went through this for us, and that all the things I'm about to describe are things that we technically deserve. So, first off, crucifixion was usually preceded by brutal torture, normally through physical abuse and flogging. In addition to this, during this time period, there were reports of people being tormented with whips, fire, and all sorts of other tortures before the crucifixion. I don't have it with me, but whenever I taught the same stuff to my students last year, I did have that cat of 9 tails that Sean and I made for the Easter service at church, if you remember that.
Last year?
Yeah, well, I showed it to my students last year, but at the Easter service, remember how I made the cat of 9 tails, like the rope with the glass shards and stuff like that? We'll talk about that again in a second. But whenever you just look at that thing, it would hurt. I remember when Sean and I were making it, we had cuts all over our hands and stuff just from making the scourge. Imagine actually being hit with it. It'd be terrible. And typically, that is how the crucifixion process would begin, right? Typically, somebody would be scourged first to open up wounds and just make it really, really bad. And like I said, there was also reports of them being tormented in other ways. We don't have reason to believe that Jesus was tormented in other ways. We do know that he was beaten and they tore out his beard and stuff like that. The Gospels do tell us that, but we don't have any evidence of him being tormented with a whip or fire or anything like that. But we do know that he was scourged. And when you look at the Gospel accounts, it actually seems like that there could be evidence that he was scourged to a more severe degree than most people would be. Because, if you recall, Pilate did not want to crucify Jesus. Because Pilate, his main job is to keep the peace. And so if Pilate can get away with not killing Jesus and satisfying the Jews, that is the ideal scenario. A lot of times we read into this and we think, oh, maybe Pilate was wanting to convert. I don't think so. I think Pilate was just trying to do his job well. And he recognized, if I crucify Jesus, a lot of people are going to be mad at me. If I don't crucify Jesus, a lot of people are going to be mad at me. And so he's trying to appease people. And first off, he offers them Barabbas. Right? Which one do you want? Do you want Barabbas, a known criminal, or do you want Jesus, a pretty chill dude? Typically, you would expect them to pick Jesus because you don't want a criminal running amok in your streets. But they pick Barabbas. And so Pilate's like, okay, let's try something different. And then it says he handed him over to be scourged. Most likely, what I imagine, and once again, this is kind of me reading more into the biblical account than what the Bible tells us, I would imagine that Pilate told them to scourge Jesus as close to death as possible, so that hopefully the Jewish people would look on him and have mercy and say, you know what, he's been punished enough, maybe going forward Jesus will just be quiet and do his own thing, right? And I think that whenever you actually look at how Jesus endures crucifixion, it would suggest that he has been flogged to a more severe degree than most people, just because we'll see he can't even carry his cross by the end. And so it seems like he is weaker than most people would typically be. But yeah, so crucifixion typically was preceded by scourging. And at times, the flesh of scourge victims could be so torn by whips that their veins and arteries became visible, and there were times where they were whipped to the bone or when their intestines were exposed. You genuinely have not seen brutality like this. One thing you need to know about Romans is the reason they were in power is because they knew how to send a message. Right? They knew how to make it clear you do not mess with Rome. Romans did not invent crucifixion, nor did they invent torture, but in many ways they did perfect it. Because they realized the best way to get people to not revolt is by showing people what happens to people who do. And so, whenever it came to crucifixion, they didn't crucify people in hidden valleys where nobody went. They crucified people along highways. So that whenever you're walking in and out of Jerusalem, you're seeing crucified victims. Right? This would have been true probably, think about how many times Jesus probably went to Jerusalem with his family and he walked by crucified victims. Right? Anybody ever heard of Spartacus? Spartacus, he was a slave who led this rebellion. Whenever Spartacus' rebellion was subdued, him and all of his slaves, they were all crucified. I think it was hundreds, I think it lined up for several miles of just one crucified victim after another. Right? The Romans knew how to send a message. Right? When they did these scourgings, it would be a public deal. Right? It would be, hey, guys, gather around. Let us show you what happens when you mess with Rome. And they would scourge you so much that at times, literally, you could see a person's internal organs from the outside. Nowadays, we like to say that our culture is messed up. And it is. But be grateful you're not living back then. Because, a lot of times whenever people say, oh, no, it's the end of the world. Our culture is just falling apart. It tells me they haven't really studied history that much. Because, yes, we have a lot of things bad, but it could be a lot worse, right? Nowadays, people are like, oh my gosh, MMA is so brutal. These are the people who did the gladiator games, right? They would literally just get slaves to dress up in costumes and go kill one another, and they would just cheer. Or they would fill the Colosseum with water, and they would have ships out there, and they would have slaves fight and just sink each other's ships and kill each other. And it was just a sport to them, right? So it was much more brutal back then. And that's how they were able to conquer most of the known world. It was because they sent a message. And so it's very plausible that Jesus, when he was scourged, would have been ripped to shreds by that much. And you can see, once again, the main thing we're arguing, there's a very low probability of surviving crucifixion. Because you're going through all of this before you even get to the cross. Right? This is all part of the process of just getting there. If you've ever seen the movie Passion of the Christ, you've got to realize, people say that movie is way too brutal. It's actually not brutal enough. They actually had to lower down the brutality of it just so it got a rated R rating. Because if you actually depicted crucifixion how it should be depicted, it would not be. It'd be like XXX, it just would not be able to be rated because it's just so brutal, and that's something you have to realize. So if you get squeamish at the Passion of the Christ movie, you got to realize being there in person had to be terrible, and it's easy to look down on the disciples for not being present, but I would say that it says a whole lot about the Apostle John that he was, because it'd be hard to see anybody be crucified, much less somebody that you knew and loved, and somebody like I don't know, it'd be very difficult. So this is typically how they would do it, right? They would typically strip the person's body down, and they didn't always like hang them for something like that tall. There's different positions they could put them in, and sometimes they would just move them around just to get more of their body, right? One thing that you'll often hear, which is actually a misconception, you'll hear that Jesus was whipped 39 times. We don't know that. The 39 whip rule, or what is it? I forget how Paul puts it. But the 39 lashes, right? The 39 lashes, that's actually a Jewish custom, right? Because if you go to the Torah and it talks about how to punish criminals, it says you cannot whip somebody more than 40 times.
Right.
And so, according to the Torah, you couldn't whip people more than 40 times. And even that whip, that was just with a normal whip, right? Because God considered more than 40 to be, that's cruel and unusual torture, right? You should not do that. And so, 40 or less, he said, that is fine. Use your best judgment. The Pharisees, being themselves, they had the oral law where they expanded upon it. They built a hedge around the law. They made it a rule that you couldn't do more than 39, just in case you miscounted. And so Paul himself, he mentions that several times at the hand of the Jews, he received 39 lashes. People will say Jesus was whipped 39 times. The Bible doesn't tell us that. And I would actually argue that that wasn't the case, because was Jesus being scourged by the Jews? No. He was being scourged by the Romans. Do the Romans follow the Torah? No. The Romans do whatever they want. So Jesus could have been flogged 10 times. He could have been flogged 100. We have no idea, right? He could have been flogged as many times as they wanted, and they could have gone for just whatever their goal is. And the people who were doing this, their main goal was to cause as much pain as possible, right? And once again, these whips, look at that, the cat o' nine tails thing. There's a wooden handle. There's this the leather thongs going out, and they would have attached bone pieces, like bone shards, metal pieces, glass fragments. They would have tied them in there so that when it hits you, it's not just making welts, right? What it does, the greatest pain for being scourged by a Roman is not being hit by the whip. The greatest pain is having the whip ripped away from you. Because what happens is whenever it gets you, it lodges in, right? It's like claws. And then whenever they rip it out, they're jerking your flesh out. That's the thing that would actually display the flesh, right? Once again, it's very gruesome, but this is what Jesus went through for us. This is what we deserved, right? And so whenever the Bible says that you can't do more than 40 lashes, you got to realize God is being very gracious. Because, that would have been with a normal whip. Which already, to us, that already sounds bad. But compare that to the Romans. For them, this is what they did. God was trying to minimize the amount of punishment you could give to criminals. Because he realized, that's even why God said eye for eye, tooth for tooth. He realized that typically whenever somebody commits a crime, our natural tendency is to take vengeance one step further than the person did towards us. Right? If you steal my eye, I chop off your head. Right? You burn down my house, I kill your whole family and burn down your village. Right? That's kind of how we go. God says, no, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Right? God is trying to limit the amount of violence that we can inflict on other people. Right? The punishment cannot exceed the crime. Rome did not have that rule. Rome, they wanted the punishment to exceed the crime so that people knew not to commit crimes against them. And so, they didn't just whip with a normal thing, they whipped with the cat o' nine tails thing. And they could have gone as long as they wanted to. They stripped the body bare to publicly humiliate the person, they chained them up so the person couldn't move, and then they would just hit them and hit them and hit them until they decided that, that's enough, right? And they usually had two people, right? They usually had one person standing on each side so they could take turns because it's very tiring, right? And so, once again, this is all just to show the probability of surviving crucifixion, not very high. But now let's talk about crucifixion itself. Crucifixion victims were either nailed or bound to a cross or tree, but nailing was the preferred method. So not all crucified victims were nailed, right? You could just be bound to the tree. They would just tie your arms up and tie your legs, and usually that would just make you suffer longer, right? Because now you're not really dying of blood loss. You're just dying of exhaustion or dying of suffocation. But we know for a fact that Jesus was nailed. Why is that? Technically, when they're talking about the crucifixion, it just says they crucified him. But how do we know that he was nailed?
There were holes in his hands.
Bingo. Right? Whenever Thomas voices his doubt, Jesus says, you can see the holes in my hands and my feet. So we know that he wasn't simply bound, he was nailed, which is the more extreme version of the punishment. It didn't always have to be on a cross. It could be on a tree. Typically, we'll talk about this in a second. I do have another diagram that I'll show y'all. It probably was not the type of cross that we typically depict. Mainly because that would be... We'll talk about it again in a second. But that'd be way too expensive and difficult to accomplish. I'll show you the type of cross they probably did crucify him on. But it could be on a tree, right? They would just crucify victims however, right? I mean, really, they just wanted to send a message. And so if there was a tree, boom, you could crucify him there too. Victims were occasionally treated brutally from the cross. And we have some extreme stories here. Get ready for these. Some of these are really, really bad. In at least one instance, a theatrical performance featured a condemned man substituted in place of an actor, and a bear was loosed to tear him to pieces on the cross. So what this is saying is that they were at a theater performance, right? Imagine you were just going to watch a play or a musical or something like that. And during the play, one of the characters is supposed to be crucified. Instead of just having an actor go through the motions of being crucified, for that scene, they substituted an actual person to be crucified. Just a person on death row, right? They put him there, and for the scene, they had a bear loosed on him to eat him alive from the cross. All for the sake of entertainment. Right? This was just like this is how lowly they viewed people who they were crucifying. And that's a historical record we have. You can go read it. This if you thought that was bad, this next one's actually worse. Like this one, like tears want to come to my eyes every time I read it. In another instance, a group of men were beaten with rods and crucified. Then their wives and sons were killed, and their now dead infant sons were hung around their necks. So typically what would happen, not typically, in this one story that we have, they were crucified after being beaten and stuff, and they were forced to watch as their wives and children were killed before them, and they couldn't do anything. They're literally stuck to the cross. And then they would take the infants and hang them around their necks so that as they die, their dead bodies, like their infant child's hanging there. You got to realize that the Romans, they weren't simply focused on physical torture. This is like emotional torture as well, right? They're trying to break the person down as much as possible because once again, it sends a message. What they're trying to teach you is do not mess with Rome. If you mess with Rome, your dead child might be hanging around your neck, and that's your fault. That's what Rome's trying to communicate. For us, we obviously would look at this, and not most cultures, probably most Western cultures would agree this is not good. But for many Eastern cultures, they view that, like they would look at this stuff and they'd say, yeah, I mean that's a way to that's a way to communicate your power. Like even to this day, that's something that we have to realize that we're very influenced by Greek thought and stuff like that, and just our societies are a lot tamer now than a lot of societies are in the world. And there's a lot of things, even when reading the Old Testament. We read the Old Testament and we're like, oh my gosh, God is so mean and brutal. No, I mean, if you show that to a person over in the East, they say, absolutely, this is what you have to do. For us, we're kind of blessed by our privilege and our prosperity that we don't realize the hard things in life. But this is how a lot of people are. And how, like, even to this day. But, yeah, so, main thing I'm highlighting here is that not only was crucifixion preceded by brutal scourging, typically, and as we know to be the case with Jesus, but we also know that they weren't like treating crucified victims with like special honors or anything, right? They treated them like slaves, like entertainment, which is consistent with what we read in Scripture. And so this is most likely how Jesus would have carried the cross. As you'll see, the cross is more of a T-shape, and that's because there's really two parts of the cross, right? There's the stipes, which is the vertical beam, and then there's the patibulum, which is the horizontal beam.
There's your delivery.
Oh, okay. And so you got the patibulum going across. That's the cross beam. And then the stipes, which is the vertical part. And it's just a delivery. Okay. And most likely, they would have just had the stipes at a set place, right? Because if you were having to move the vertical beam and the horizontal beam back and forth, that's just a lot more work on the Romans. So most likely what they would have done is they would have had crucifixions taking place at the same place pretty regularly. They would have left the vertical beams there, and then they would have only moved the horizontal beams back and forth, right? And so whenever it says Jesus carried his cross, most likely, like usually you see the depiction of him carrying the full thing, most likely that would not be the case, because first off, that would have been like 500 something pounds on its own. You wouldn't expect a normal man to be able to carry that on his own, and that was once again inconvenient to the Romans. The crossbeam itself, the patibulum, that'd be probably about 150 pounds, which you could, the average man on his shoulders, he could carry that. And so that it's much more reasonable. That's probably what Jesus is carrying. He's probably carrying the crossbeam, but that's where once again we seem to have evidence that Jesus was weaker than the typical person at this point. Because if you remember, he couldn't carry it on his own, could he? Who did they have to get to help him?
Simon Cyrene.
Yeah, Simon of Cyrene. Right? They had to bring somebody in to help him carry the cross. Typically, somebody would be able to carry their own cross to their crucifixion, but it seems like at this point, Jesus is so exhausted, and he's so near the point of death, he literally can't carry it his own. And that's probably not simply because of the flogging. It's also because Jesus knew this was coming. Right? Jesus' suffering did not begin with the flogging or the beatings. His suffering began the moment he took on flesh and dwelt among us. And every single day he stepped closer to the cross, his heart had to weigh heavier and heavier, to where by the time he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's sweating blood. He is stressed out. By the time he's even arrested, he's probably already exhausted. And then you have all this physical torture and emotional torture being placed on him. He's just weak by this point. And so what they would have done is they would have marched him over there, and typically the patibulum and the stipes, there would have been a little, a hole notched into the patibulum, and they would have just been able to set it on there. And they probably would have just had grooves already set up for different heights. And they would just if your arm didn't reach, they'd pop one out of socket just to make it reach the right spot, and they nail it in. And then they would have put the sign detailing his crime over his head. And so typically it would say something like thief or traitor or terrorist. But for Jesus, Pilate had an ironic thing put up there. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And he had it written in 3 different languages so everybody could read it. And he kind of does this to spit in the face of the Jewish people, because to him, Jesus seems innocent. Right? He has a conversation with Jesus, and Jesus says, my kingdom's not of this world. And Pilate's like, then why do I care? But he crucifies Jesus, and he says, King of the Jews. There you go. And it also is just a spit in the face of the Jewish people in general, because he's saying this is what happens to your kings. Right? If you have a king, we will kill him. And so that's most likely how it would have gone. The cross really wouldn't have been that tall. Typically, whenever you see the depiction, it's just towering 12 feet in the sky. No, it would have probably been eye level, 6 to 8 feet tall. Right? And sometimes we don't know for sure, but it could be that the legs weren't crucified one on top of another. It's very likely that they were actually crucified to the side of the beams, just to make it harder for the if the person's crucified like this, it's easier for them to push themselves up. Whereas if it's crucified on the side like that, first off, you avoid breaking through any bones. That's another thing. Whenever it says Jesus didn't break any bones, it's hard to find a place where you could crucify it on top of the foot without breaking a bone. Whereas right here, you could go through either the calf or through the almost like the Achilles right there, and you could kind of avoid bone breakage. And then what would have happened when you're on the cross is something that I don't even remember where I read this. I don't know if it was actually called this or not, but somewhere I'm pretty sure it was called the Dance of Death. But regardless of the name of it, basically what happens is that when you're on the cross, you're basically going back and forth on a constant cycle between suffocation and intense pain, right? Because naturally, when you're hanging from a cross, you're naturally going to droop forward, right? And you're going to be hanging slack. The issue is that puts a lot of strain on your lungs and your diaphragm and everything, to where you cannot breathe. And so whenever you're out of breath, you finally have to muster up your courage and push yourself up to breathe, but now you're pressing all the pressure down on the wounds where you're attached to the beams. And so you can only maintain that for a certain amount of time before your muscles will just give out, and then you're slumping back down. And so when you're on the cross, you're on a constant cycle of like just going up and down, up and down. And that's why eventually if they were trying to speed up the death, they would break the legs. Because then it forces you to go down and you suffocate to death. Whereas in general, you were just up there going up and down until you literally just died of exhaustion, blood loss, suffocation, any of it. This is typically how they would crucify the arms. So whenever Jesus says, like, the holes in my hands and my feet, the word for hand in Greek can refer to the hand, but it can also refer to the whole, like, arm itself. Most likely, Jesus was not crucified through the hand. He was most likely crucified through right here. Yeah, just because if you were to just crucify somebody through the hand, and you were just like hang them there, like it would just like rip through their skin and they would fall down. So if they did that, they would also have to like tie up like ropes to support them. So more likely he was crucified right there because you know you have like the two bones right there. So it would have just like held it snug in place. That's typically what they would have done. Yeah. I just can't even imagine that. They just like just the length of those nails, they would have like nailed them in and then like, you know, hammered them down the other side to like lodge it. Just the pain of being on a cross. It's something that you really can't even fathom, because think about how used to we are to like motion, right? Like think about how much I talk with my hands. Imagine being stuck in a position where you know you are never going to move again. Like this position is you're stuck there, and that is how you're going to die. Right? You will never be able to give somebody a hug. You'll never be able to wave at somebody. You will never leave this beam right here until you die. Like it's just once again, it's more than just physical. It's an emotional torture to where the whole moment there you are being also you're stripped naked during all of this. Keep in mind, like usually the depictions that we have them being wrapped in stuff. Typically they wouldn't do that. We usually do that just for the sake of decency. They would have stripped them naked because it's public shaming, right? They want, you know. Even if you're not afraid of physical torture, you should be afraid of being publicly shamed like this. And so it would have been something where you're just stripped totally naked, you're hanging from the cross, people can see everything, and it's psychological torture, physical, emotional, everything. They're trying to break you down, and they're trying to break down the loved ones who are watching this. So the loved ones can share this with other people so that they can stop further things like this from happening. So you can see right here just different diagrams of what it would have done to the ribs, to the diaphragm, to the lungs, all that stuff. You'd just be totally falling apart. Yeah. Here's another one. This is what would happen when it's talking about piercing the side, right? So they knew right where they could pierce it to where it would pierce up into the heart. And whenever John says that blood and water came out, that is testifying to the fact that he did in fact die. Right, because if he is still alive, first off, he would have had a reaction to being stabbed in the heart, but he didn't. And also, I believe it's only one or the other would have come out. Like it tells you that he's already started going into the decomposing process, basically. And so there's all that. And so when it comes down to it, once you look at all of that information, right, what are the four evidences that we have of the crucifixion? Let me test you. What was the first one? Multiple attestation. Second one? Early attestation. Third one? Credible attestation. And fourth?
The evidence of
crucifixion. The probability of surviving crucifixion. It's not very high. Right? Whenever you take all four of those, simply from a historical perspective, we can say this. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to quote a bunch of scholars for you. Not all of these guys are Christians, just to show you that they all agree. Even those scholars and critics who have been moved to depart from almost everything else within the historical content of Christ's presence on earth have found it impossible to think away the factuality of the death of Christ. Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. There is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. That he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. That's a pretty bold statement. And I also want you to just recognize that historians typically understate their case. They will typically not say that something is as historical as something can ever be. Usually they will, like they do the same thing that scientists do, right? I mean, actually I would say scientists sometimes overstate their case more than they should. But historians typically are more conservative in things, and they will say, you know what, we have good evidence for it, but it's not as sure, right? Like science, they'll call things scientific fact, even though it's really just theory. Whereas historians, what they'll typically do is they'll have a grading scale, right? They'll have something where it says, like, they'll never say that something is historical fact. They will say something is as likely as possible, or there's different terms. It's there's like as plausible as not. There is plausible. There's more plausible than not. There is probable. There is more probable than not. Then there's highest likely probability, and then it goes to the other extent as well. They usually have like 5 to 10 grading things that they can give, and they'll never say we know 100% that this happened, right? They'll just say this is the highest likely probability, and that's what this guy is saying here. It is as sure as anything historical can ever be. The Passion of Jesus is part of history. The single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome preserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. So that's the first historical fact that we can know with confidence. Right? Practically everybody agrees, whether you're talking about a Christian, whether you're talking about an atheist, whether you're talking about a Jehovah's Witness, Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Cthulhu worshiper, I don't know. Anybody who is a genuine historian who has studied this stuff agrees Jesus died a death by crucifixion. That's fact number one. Does that prove that he resurrected? No. But it proves the necessary prerequisite to resurrection. Right? You cannot have a resurrection if you do not have a death that precedes it. So this is super essential for us. But that's all we're talking about today. Next week, what we're going to start talking about, and we might be able to fit in more than just this. I don't remember. I need to look at some weeks we might be able to fit in 2 facts or something like that. But next week, we're going to talk about fact number 2, which is ladies discovering the empty tomb. Once again, all because we established this fact will not prove that Jesus resurrected. It will simply prove that come Sunday morning, the tomb was empty. So, basically what I'm saying is that whatever hypothesis or conclusion you come to, it has to account for that. Right? Some people will say, oh, well, they just went to the wrong tomb. That's another theory that people will present. Okay, well, then why did people take them to the right tomb? Right? So, next week we will start talking about that one. Sound good?
Yes.
And, any questions? Comments?
Hope we don't have nightmares after
Yeah,
this.
hopefully I don't
Hopefully
go to
not.
bed tonight and dream of getting beaten by a cat 9 tails.
Yeah.
And
It's stuff, like the stuff we talked about today is stuff that people are often afraid to talk about, but I think it's stuff we need to talk about. I don't think you can truly appreciate what Christ went through unless you actually familiarize yourself with what he went through.
Right.
I don't know. Like that's something where people will say, "Oh, I just don't want my kids to see the Passion of the Christ." I'm like, I don't know. Like I understand wanting to protect your kids from gruesome stuff like that, but also that's what Jesus went through. That's the gospel. And I think the better you can visualize it, the more you'll appreciate what he went through. Because I don't know, the more distant we are from it, the less we will be attached to it. But it is very gruesome. So yeah. All right, I'll pray for us. Lord, we thank you for giving us minds to look into stuff like this, and I thank you for the minds way smarter than ours who were able to collect all this information for us to just kind of repackage and talk about in a more concise manner. And even though mostly what we've done today, God, is more scholarly and academic in nature, I pray that as Christians we won't allow that to divorce us from the fact that we are reflecting on things that we believe to have historically happened. And as we talked about the gruesome reality of scourging and crucifixion, I pray that we will reflect on the fact that we are the ones who deserve to be scourged and crucified, and that you were pierced for our transgressions and you were crushed for our iniquities, and that by your stripes that we are healed. And so, God, I pray that we will take the information we learned today and talked about today, and we will use it to reflect on what you did. And who knows, maybe we will go to bed tonight and we will have nightmares about this stuff, God. But I pray that those nightmares will be for your glory. And I think that they should scare us. And I think that they should scare us into reverence. So that, on one hand, we recognize the severe penalty of sin and the consequences of what we do when we sin against you. But at the same time, God, we will recognize the richness of your love and the fact that you are willing to bear that consequence on our behalf. We love you, God. We thank you for doing what we could not do and for living the life we could not live, and for dying the death that we deserved. And as we go about the study, let us rejoice in the life that you were raised to, so that we can also rejoice in the future hope that we will one day be raised to life with you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.